Yo, spirit warriors, gather round, because this isn't just another feel-good pep talk. It's a spiritual awakening disguised as a mic drop. Do you ever feel that inner tremor, like your soul finally stood up and said, enough? That's not random, that's alignment, and it hits hard the moment you stop shrinking yourself to fit spaces you've outgrown. Chosen ones, there's something profoundly holy about the moment you start saying no without guilt. No long texts explaining your boundaries, no over-apologizing for protecting your peace, just a calm, centered refusal that echoes louder than any scream. People around you pause, they stare, not because you were rude, but because you finally remembered your worth. Let me tell you about someone we'll call Zion. This man was practically a spiritual doormat, always available, always exhausted. He was a walking lighthouse, guiding others while slowly drowning himself. But one morning, something snapped, or rather, a divine reboot. Zion drew the line. No big announcement, no drama, just action. And suddenly, everyone who benefited from his brokenness started panicking. They didn't fear him. They feared facing themselves without him. See, when a chosen one wakes up, it's like lighting a match in a dark room. Your glow exposes what others have been trying to hide, even from themselves. Psychologically speaking, people often react with resistance or hostility when faced with change, especially when it disrupts the roles they've boxed you into. Your transformation creates what Carl Jung called a shadow confrontation. You've stopped operating from a trauma response. No more codependency, no more spiritual martyrdom. Now you're moving with clarity, and that scares people who relied on your confusion. That mirror effect is real. Your growth forces others to face the question, why haven't changed? And guess what? That's no longer your business. You didn't come here to be liked, you came here to be. So light that incense, grab that tea, and let's dive into the next chapter of your evolution. Because this isn't about revenge or rebellion, it's about resurrection. You didn't just set boundaries, you're not the same anymore. You're becoming the version of yourself that was hidden beneath years of people-pleasing and silent suffering. And now that you've stepped into your authority, don't be surprised when the temple starts shaking. Spirit warriors, your shift is not only sacred, it's necessary. Let's go. Point 1, you don't explain yourself anymore. Remember those days when you felt compelled to twist yourself into emotional knots just to decline a simple invitation? You'd start with, I can't come because I'm tired, but I really wish I could. Trying to soften the blow, pad the rejection, and avoid the dreaded discomfort of disappointing someone. That wasn't a mere explanation. It was a theatrical performance, a delicate dance to maintain peace, please others, and avoid being seen as selfish or difficult. But that was a different version of you. That was before you stepped into your identity as the chosen one, before you shed the skin of people-pleasing and stepped into the armor of self-respect. Now, you respond with calm certainty. I won't be attending. No added footnotes, no desperate need for validation, just clarity. This isn't just personal growth, it's psychological liberation. Over-explaining is often a trauma response. Studies in behavioral psychology have shown that individuals who grew up in invalidating environments where emotions were minimized, boundaries were trampled, or independence was punished, learn to over-justify their choices in order to feel safe. You weren't born needing to explain yourself. You were trained to believe that your truth alone wasn't enough. But the truth is, your no is a complete sentence. You're not obligated to wrap it in pretty paper or hand it over with a nervous smile. The shift that happens when you stop explaining everything, it's seismic, because in that moment you stop leaking energy. Emotional leakage through over-apologizing, defending, or tiptoeing is one of the greatest drains on your mental and spiritual well-being. It's like trying to hold water in a cracked vessel. No matter how much you pour in, it keeps seeping out. But when you patch those cracks with boundaries, firm, loving, divine boundaries, you become a fortress. Not a wall to keep people out, but a container that protects what's sacred within. That's why people who used to thrive on your guilt now find themselves confused. You've changed the script, and they don't know their lines anymore. You're no longer the person who responds immediately, who explains your every decision, who feels obligated to soothe their discomfort. And they don't know what to do with that. Because control is a quiet addiction, especially for those who once pulled the strings of your kindness to meet their own ends. But now those strings have snapped, and you're no one's puppet. What's even more powerful is that you've embraced silence, not as passivity, but as sacred strength. You don't need to argue your worth. You don't need to debate your decisions. You've discovered that the quiet confidence of a well-placed no echoes louder than the most passionate justification. And spiritually speaking, this is huge. Scripture reminds us in Matthew 5:37, let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything more, it says, comes from confusion and unrest. So when you speak with clarity, you align yourself with divine order. You become a vessel of peace, not performance. People may call you distant, cold, aloof, but what they're really witnessing is someone who no longer performs emotional labor to earn scraps of acceptance. You're not rude, you're refined. You're not selfish, you're sovereign. This evolution isn't about rebellion, it's about reverence. Reverence for your own soul, reverence for your divine calling, and reverence for the God who set you apart, not to blend in, but to rise up. So here's to saying less and meaning more, to walk away without guilt, to honor God by honoring your boundaries. This is the new you, unbothered, unapologetic, and spiritually grounded. And that shakes the room louder than any over-explained apology ever could. Point 2, you say no without guilt. Once upon a time, guilt controlled you like a remote in someone else's hand. Every favor, every yes you gave, even when you were exhausted, stretched thin, or intuitively uncomfortable, came from that invisible leash of guilt. Maybe you said yes to family because you didn't want to disappoint them, or you agreed to something for friends, even when it compromised your own needs, just to avoid being labeled selfish or ungrateful. That leash was made of invisible pressure, tight around your neck, dictating your moves, silencing your truth, but not anymore. Something powerful happened. You woke up. You snatched that leash off, not with vengeance, but with awareness. And instead of tossing it aside, you refashioned it into a crown, your crown. That's what real transformation looks like. You took what was used to control you and turned it into a symbol of your authority, your worth, and your spiritual growth. No used to sound like rebellion. Now, it sounds like reverence. You've learned that no is a full sentence. No need to decorate it with excuses or apologies. That one-word declaration is your spiritual armor. It's not about being rude, distant, or heartless. It's about discernment. When you say no, you're not closing doors. You're guarding gates. You're protecting your time, your energy, and your divine assignment. Science even backs this up. Studies in psychology show that people who confidently say no when they mean it tend to experience lower levels of stress, anxiety, and burnout. It's not just spiritual, it's mental hygiene. Your no keeps your inner world clean and focused. Here's what most people miss. Saying yes to everything is not kindness, it's self-abandonment. And self-abandonment is not a virtue. It's a silent killer of dreams, peace, and purpose. Every time you say yes, just to keep the peace, you're putting your calling on pause. But you've evolved. The old you said yes because you feared rejection. The awakened you says no because you honor your peace. And yes, they're going to talk. They're going to call you difficult, uncooperative, too much, or hard to deal with. But that's okay. Let them whisper. Because while they're stuck in groupthink, heaven is calling you disciplined. That's right. Discipline is the new loyalty. Loyalty to your soul, your boundaries, and your destiny. Even in Scripture, Jesus himself walked away from the crowd to pray, to be alone, and to recharge. He didn't say yes to every request or chase approval. That's not selfishness. That's strategy. That's divine alignment. You're following in powerful footsteps when you learn how to retreat, reflect, and say no. And those same people who once benefited from your people-pleasing, they may not applaud your growth, but they feel it. They feel the shift. They see the glow. Some may even feel foolish because while they were busy misusing your time, energy, and kindness, you were silently transforming. You were building. You were healing. You were aligning. So don't get bitter. Get better. Don't fight for their approval. Stand firm in your purpose. Let them sit in their discomfort, not out of cruelty, but because that's what accountability feels like. Sometimes God uses your boundaries to teach others their own lessons. You're not responsible for their reactions. You're responsible for your obedience to your higher calling. Your no is sacred. It's not just a boundary, it's a declaration that says, I know who I am, I know what I carry, and I won't waste my oil. So let them talk, let them misunderstand. Because the truth is, when heaven whispers your name, it doesn't echo through the crowd. It echoes through your courage, your clarity, and your crown. Walk tall, Queen, your no is holy. Point 3, you don't react, you observe. There was a time when chaos felt like a frequent visitor in your life. Trouble didn't always knock loudly. It often crept in subtly, disguised as that coworker who always found a way to undermine you, or the family member who weaponized familiarity to dig the deepest wounds. They weren't necessarily evil people, but their unresolved pain made your peace feel like a threat. Your very presence, radiant, intentional, growing, mirrored back to them everything they were avoiding within themselves. So they baited you, provoked you, and poked at your boundaries just to make you explode. And sometimes you did, because back then you hadn't yet realized that your emotional reaction was feeding their sense of control. You thought you were defending yourself, but what you were really doing was handing over your power. But life has a way of teaching us, painfully, sometimes beautifully, that growth begins with silence, that wisdom enters through stillness, that power isn't loud or flashy, but calm, deliberate, and deeply spiritual. Now, instead of reacting, you pause, you breathe, and that simple pause. That's not hesitation. That's mastery. Psychologists and neuroscientists call it emotional regulation, the capacity to choose your response instead of being hijacked by your feelings. This ability activates the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of your brain associated with long-term thinking, empathy, and morality. In other words, when you take a breath before you speak, you're not backing down. You're stepping into the highest version of yourself. Spiritually and neurologically, you're moving with divine intelligence. And those who once fed off your emotional whirlwind, they don't know what to do with this new you. You've become unshakable. Your silence unnerves them because it no longer gives them access. Your restraint frustrates them because it reveals how little power they ever had to begin with. What they called walking away used to be painted as weakness, but now it's wisdom. You no longer feel the need to explain yourself to everyone. You no longer spend your sacred energy on battles that aren't yours. You don't cast your pearls to swine, not because you're better than anyone, but because you finally learned what those pearls are worth. Stillness for you is sacred. It's the language of the spiritually mature. It's not passive or apathetic. It's protective. You've come to understand that the true enemy is rarely a person. It's often spiritual disorientation, emotional manipulation, and mental distraction. And the adversary, the enemy of your soul, doesn't need to destroy your life if he can just distract your mind. If he can get you to, he can pull you off your path. But you've learned the art of staying rooted, of responding from purpose rather than pain. And that's why you're dangerous now, not because you're aggressive, but because you're aligned. You don't need to prove your worth to anyone anymore. The healed version of you doesn't argue. The wise version doesn't perform. You let your actions speak. You let your peace preach. You rise, not to impress, but to fulfill your calling. And ironically, the very people who once tried to tear you down now watch you in silence. Some with awe, some with confusion, some even with conviction, because your transformation is a revelation. They expected rage, but got resolve. They expected chaos, but found clarity. Without lifting a finger, you've taught them something they never expected to learn from you, what true strength looks like. So protect your peace like it's sacred, because it is. You've cried for it, bled for it, prayed for it, and now that you have it, guard it like treasure. You don't owe the world your reaction. You owe yourself the freedom you fought for. And sometimes the greatest act of spiritual warfare is not to retaliate, but to remain unmoved. That's stillness, that's not weakness, that's your power, that's your anointing. And that's exactly why they can't touch you anymore. Point 4, you don't need to be liked to feel loved. Whew, this one's big, and we mean soul-shaking big. Remember that version of yourself that bent over backward, twisted into 1,000 awkward shapes just to keep the peace? Like some kind of spiritual origami, you folded your truth, pressed down your voice, and creased your spirit just to fit inside someone else's mold. You were the fixer, the mediator, the overthinker, the one who said sorry for things that were never your fault. You walked on eggshells in rooms where you were actually the brightest light, but you dimmed yourself anyway, afraid to shine too boldly. It wasn't just emotional, it was spiritual self-erasure. A quiet denial of the truth God planted in you, and you did it because you thought that love, acceptance, and belonging came with terms and conditions, that to be included you had to be edited. But then something shifted. Maybe it didn't arrive with fanfare, no fireworks, no drum roll, just a slow, steady awakening, a holy nudge in your chest that whispered, and with that truth, a freedom you hadn't felt in years began to break through the surface. Because the moment you stop chasing the applause of people and start anchoring your identity in the approval of God, you are no longer a prisoner to anyone's opinion. You stop shrinking in rooms you've outgrown. You stop saying yes when your soul is screaming no. You stop apologizing for existing in your full power. Here's the deeper truth. People-pleasing is more than just a bad habit. It's a trauma response. Psychologists call it fawning, a survival mechanism where you seek safety by appeasing others. You become hyper-aware of others' moods, walking emotional tightropes just to keep everyone happy. But spiritually, it's even more serious. It's the slow abandonment of your divine identity. It's forgetting that you were not created to blend in. You were chosen to stand out. God didn't call you to be liked by everyone. He called you to live in truth, purpose, and bold alignment with Him. The approval of man is fleeting, but the calling of God is eternal. And when you finally begin to live from that place, from the understanding that God's opinion of you is the only one that truly matters, everything changes. You stop auditioning for roles in people's lives that were never meant for you. You stop being the emotional crutch, the perpetual yes person, and the convenient shoulder. The version of you who ignored red flags, stayed in toxic spaces, and laughed at jokes that hurt your spirit. That version no longer gets to drive your life, and make no mistake, people notice. Some feel disoriented, even betrayed. But what they're really mourning is the loss of control they once had over a version of you who didn't know their worth. Biblically, this transformation is echoed in the story of David. When he stepped forward to fight Goliath, Saul tried to dress him in his royal armor, but David refused. Why? Because it wasn't made for him. He didn't need someone else's covering to do what God called him to do. He walked out with a sling, a stone, and full confidence in who God said he was. That's the power of spiritual authenticity. When you step out of man-made expectations and step into God-given identity, even giants fall. From a psychological standpoint, people who operate with an internal locus of control, meaning they believe their value comes from within, not from external validation, are more resilient, less anxious, and more emotionally intelligent. They don't break under pressure because they're not building their identity on someone else's shaky foundation. They don't chase approval, they attract respect. They're not arrogant, they're anchored. And that kind of energy unsettles those who profited from your insecurity. So when they start getting uncomfortable with the new you, the one who sets boundaries, says no without guilt, and walks away without looking back, let them. Their discomfort is not your responsibility. Their confusion is not your problem. You've stopped people-pleasing and started God-pleasing. And in doing so, you've traded survival for significance. You're not just existing anymore, you're rising. You're not just healing, you're becoming whole. This version of you, the one who walks in clarity, power, and obedience, that version is sacred, that version is dangerous, and that version is free. Point 5, you detach from toxic familiarity. Chosen ones, let's talk about boundaries, not bitterness. There's a world of difference between the two, but in a society where people expect access to your energy just because they've known you for years, it can get blurry. Think about that moment when you finally pressed block on a cousin who only calls when their world is on fire, or when you stopped chasing after a so-called friend who only applauded you when they were standing in your spotlight. That sting you felt. It wasn't bitterness, it was the pain of growth, the ache of finally choosing yourself. And while it may feel like rejection to them, to you, it's a sacred act of reclamation. You're not being cruel, you're being clear. And clarity, as Proverbs 4:7 tells us, is the beginning of wisdom. We're taught from a young age that family is everything and that childhood friends deserve lifelong loyalty. But spiritual maturity requires that we challenge those scripts. Just because someone shared your past doesn't mean they're entitled to your present or your future. History alone doesn't equal loyalty. Loyalty is proven through consistency, respect, and presence. If someone only shows up when they need something, they're not loyal, they're opportunistic. And when you begin to evolve, when your spirit awakens to your divine calling, these patterns become painfully obvious. You start realizing who claps because they love you and who claps because they think it's expected. You stop justifying toxic behavior in the name of keeping the peace. You finally see that peace bought through silence and self-sacrifice isn't peace at all. It's prison. Scientific research supports this inner wisdom. A study published by Harvard in 2018 as part of the long-running Harvard study of adult development revealed that the quality of our relationships is the biggest predictor of long-term health and happiness. Not fame, not wealth, just healthy, genuine connections. Relationships that support, rather than sabotage, are essential to emotional and even physical well-being. Think of it this way. Your nervous system thrives in safety. If every interaction with a certain person triggers anxiety, fear, or dread, your body is literally telling you, this is not where we belong. That's not bitterness, that's biology. Boundaries are not just a spiritual tool, they are a psychological necessity. Setting limits isn't about rejecting others, it's about protecting yourself. And for chosen ones, who are often empaths and deep feelers, this becomes even more critical. We tend to give and give, often at the expense of our own well-being, until we wake up one day exhausted, misunderstood, and surrounded by people who never truly saw us. But once you draw the line, once you stop explaining, overextending, and excusing, it's like coming up for air after years underwater. And yes, they'll notice, the cousin, the friend, and the co-worker. They'll all feel the shift. They may say you've changed. And you have. You've grown, you've healed, you've awakened. The truth is, not everyone can go where God is taking you. Some people were only assigned to a chapter of your life, not the whole book, and that's okay. You're not responsible for their discomfort with your evolution. You're only responsible for walking in the light God has given you. And sometimes God uses your boundaries to be the very mirror others need to confront their own dysfunction. That's not your problem to manage, that's their opportunity to grow. So don't shrink back. Don't second guess. You're not bitter, you're becoming better. Every firm no you say to dysfunction is a yes to purpose. Every door you close on manipulation is a gateway to peace. You're not cold-hearted, you're clear-headed. You're not turning your back, you're turning the page. And that's what chosen ones do. They don't cling to what was. They step boldly into what's becoming. Keep rising, keep glowing, and let those who didn't value your presence feel the impact of your distance. Point 6. You prioritize your purpose over their opinions. Opinions are loud, unfiltered, constant. Everyone has one. And in today's world, people hand them out like candy, whether you ask for them or not. Your choices, commented on. Your silence, misinterpreted. Your growth, criticized. But purpose doesn't need to shout. Purpose whispers softly, steadily, sacredly. And lately you've started listening, not to the world's chaos, but to your soul's clarity. That quiet internal nudge reminding you you're here for more than just people-pleasing and burnout. You're here on assignment. Chosen ones, this shift you've made is powerful. You're setting new boundaries, protecting your creative energy, your sacred solitude, your rest and your reflection. Maybe you've stopped answering calls that drain you. Maybe you no longer show up to every family event just to prove you care. Maybe your weekends now look more like quiet mornings with God than nights filled with meaningless noise. And let's be real, it's got people salty. Why? Because access to you was once unlimited. You gave your time freely, your talents generously, and your heart openly, but they mistook your kindness for convenience. They grew entitled to your light, forgetting it wasn't theirs to control. Now that you've learned to guard it, the same people who once took you for granted are questioning your loyalty. Funny, isn't it? But don't be shaken. You're not in people's lives to be convenient. You were never meant to be a background character in their drama. You're a main character in God's divine screenplay. Your life, your gifts, your voice, it's all part of a greater purpose, a spiritual contract you agreed to long before you arrived here. And the moment you chose alignment over approval, heaven took notice. Science even backs this up. Studies in psychology show that people with a strong sense of purpose experience lower stress, better sleep, and improved well-being. Why? Because purpose acts like an inner compass. It gives you direction when everything else is pulling you off course. When you listen to purpose rather than opinions, you reclaim your power. You move from reacting to life to intentionally living it. Let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them gossip over why you don't show up like you used to. What they don't understand is that you're showing up more than ever, but this time for yourself, for your calling, for your mission. And when they realize that their access was a privilege, not a right, it will humble them. In fact, many will be forced to confront their own reflections. They'll realize you weren't ignoring them, you were answering a higher call. And while some will sit with regret, others will learn, because God doesn't waste relationships, even the messy ones. Sometimes He uses your boundaries to teach others their own. Sometimes your no becomes someone else's wake-up call. So hold firm. Guard your time like treasure, because it is. Guard your peace like gold, because it's priceless. You're not missing out. You're tuning in. And when you choose obedience over popularity, when you prioritize vision over validation, heaven doesn't just cheer. You activate blessings. Let them be loud. Let them speculate. Let the world wonder why you've changed. The ones who matter will adjust. The rest, they were never meant to follow you to this next level anyway. Chosen one, your purpose is sacred. And now that you've started listening to its whisper, there's no going back. Keep building, keep rising, keep choosing alignment. The noise may grow louder, but so will your faith. Because when you walk in divine purpose, even the whispers can shake the world. Point 7, you love without losing yourself. This is the final boss level, the place where your old identity, forged in survival and self-neglect, lays down its armor for good. This is the sacred threshold where your evolution finally clicks into divine alignment. You once loved people with such intensity that you forgot yourself entirely in the process. You overgave, you overcompensated. You were the emotional first responder, the tireless forgiver, the eternal giver, even when your soul was gasping for air. You believed, perhaps because the world trained you to, that love meant erasing yourself so others could stay comfortable. That care meant being endlessly available, that to be worthy you had to bend until you broke. But now you've awakened, you've graduated, you've leveled up not with vengeance but with vision. You've come to understand that divine love has structure, that boundaries aren't barriers, they're sacred borders of self-respect. You've stopped signing emotional blank checks in the name of unconditional love, because you finally see the truth. Unconditional love does not mean unconditional access. Psychologically speaking, this transformation is powerful and measurable. Research from the American Psychological Association links firm boundaries to increased self-worth and reduced anxiety. Dr. Brené Brown's extensive work on vulnerability and boundaries reveals that the most compassionate people are also the most boundaried. Why? Because they know that to truly love others, they must also honor themselves. Boundaries, she says, are where we can love both others and ourselves without resentment. This is not cruelty, it's clarity, it's spiritual intelligence, it's the refusal to participate in your own erosion. You've realized that being Christ-like doesn't mean being exploited, that being loving doesn't mean being foolish, that forgiveness is a command, but enabling is a choice. And sometimes the holiest thing you can do is walk away. Theologically, your transformation echoes Scripture. Proverbs 4:23 tells us, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. That doesn't mean closing your heart, it means managing the flow, it means choosing who and what deserves your presence. Jesus himself set boundaries. He withdrew from crowds, said no to certain demands, and didn't entrust himself to everyone, John 2:24. Even the Savior didn't make himself emotionally available to all, so why should you? And this is where your power now resides. You still love, but with discernment. You still care, but from a place of balance. You're no longer love-starved or attention-hungry. You've chosen yourself, not out of ego, but out of reverence for the divine spark within you. You now understand you don't need to bleed to prove you're alive. You don't need to break to prove you're real. God didn't create you to be a doormat. He called you to be a door of light, a vessel of truth, and a reflection of His wholeness. So when people say you've changed, smile, because you have. You've evolved into someone who won't shrink for others' comfort. You're no longer bending, you're building. Not walls, but gates. Gates of glory, and through those gates only the aligned may enter.